What I'd like to know is why the study of how we acquire language was important to you, and what has it revealed to us in a broad sense about how the mind works?
Well, traditionally, the capacity for language has been understood to be almost a defining property of the human species. If you go back, say, take Cartesian philosophy, the 17th century dominant philosophy out of which grew the Enlightenment and so on. For Descartes, it literally was the defining property. Remember, for Descartes, it was critical to distinguish creatures with minds, soul or minds, from those who didn't have them. The ones who didn't have souls and minds were machines. That was the mechanical philosophy that was the basis for early modern science. They were machines. Those with souls and minds were human. Well, how would you determine whether some creature has a mind? The proposals that come from Descartes and his followers were by testing their language abilities. You ask, do they have this fundamental creative capacity that humans have and that they exhibit in their normal use of language? What's the creative capacity? I think they captured the essence of it pretty accurately. It's the ability which all humans share, and no, according to them, no animal or machine shares, to create and produce freely new expressions which are appropriate to situations, but not caused by situations. They're not the result of stimuli coming from the outside, or for that matter, even internal stimuli. There's a big difference between being caused and being appropriate. It's a crucial difference. A hard one to capture, but we recognize it. So this innovative behavior has no limits. It can go on indefinitely. In fact, most linguistic performance is new sentences, maybe never produced in the history of the world, or in your own experience at least. And they're also intelligible to others, who recognize, yeah, I could have expressed that thought in that way if it had come to mind. Well, that capacity, sort of a creative aspect of language use, was regarded, and I think plausibly, as a kind of a core component of human cognition, human morality, moral judgment, and in fact, human activity. This was connected, especially in the early days of classical liberalism, people like Smith, von Humboldt, and others. This was connected with the belief that humans basically have a need, a fundamental need, to carry out creative work under their own control. This was put very nicely by Wilhelm von Humboldt, the founder of the modern university system, also a great linguist and one of the founders of classical liberalism. His point was, the way he put it is that if an artisan creates a beautiful piece of work on command, we may admire what he did, but we despise what he is, namely a tool in the hands of others. On the other hand, if that artisan produces the same beautiful work under his own control and initiative, we admire not only the piece of work, but also the artisan himself, who it is. Actually, Adam Smith said the same thing. Everyone has read the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, where, talks about the butcher does this and the baker does that, and everybody's happy. It comes out in favor of division of labor. Very few people have gone on a couple hundred pages into this rather dense book when Smith returns to the notion of division of labor and says that division of labor cannot be tolerated because it will turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can possibly be, just routinely under command, performing the same actions over and over. And he says in any civilized society, the government's going to have to step in to do something about it. Education, other things. If you take a look at the scholarly editions of Wealth of Nations, say the University of Chicago Bicentennial Scholarly Edition, you take a look under Division of Labor, and you'll notice this passage isn't even listed in the index. The most important passage about division of labor. It's not, I'm sure it was not intended deceit. I think they just couldn't understand it. It's just an unintelligible view in the modern conception. So you kind of read the words, but they don't get beyond the eyes. But that conception is really fundamental to classical liberalism. I think it's correct. And they related it loosely to the creative aspect of language use. Well, we're very far from having answers to any of these questions, I should say. But there are steps towards it. And the major steps do happen to be in the study of language. There are applications, thoughts about it elsewhere, but that's where the main work is. And some rather surprising things have come out, I think. It's sort of useful to compare what's been done in the last roughly 60 years to the very early days of modern science. One of the great breakthroughs in modern science, say Galileo, the Galilean period, was to be willing to be puzzled about things that seemed obvious. That's a tremendous step forward. So, for example, for literally thousands of years, it had been accepted by important scientists that we have answers to some very simple questions. Like when I hold this thing up, if I let it go, the cup's going to drop. If this happened to be boiling water inside and I lift the lid, the steam will go up. So the cup drops and the steam rises. Well, Aristotle had an answer to why they're seeking their natural place. And that was taken to be the appropriate answer for thousands of years, when Galileo and others said, let's be puzzled about this. Let's just not take it for granted because it comes from authority. And when you start being puzzled about it, modern science begins. You see, you don't know the answers. And when you try to find out the answers, they break down. It shows that all sorts of intuitions are just wildly off. And you finally, out of this, slowly comes modern science. And I think that's what's been happening in study of language since roughly the early 1950s, approximately. A lot of things that seemed completely obvious were looked at carefully, and they all turned out to be extremely puzzling. So I'll take a simple example, which has kind of evolved in industry of analysis. Take the sentence, a short sentence. Can eagles that fly swim? Okay, we all understand it. We know that the word can is associated with swim, not fly. We're asking, can they swim, not can they fly? Similarly, we can say things like, are eagles that fly swimming? But we can't say, are eagles that flying swim? Actually, if you think about it, that's a fine thought. It says, are the eagles that are flying swimming too? So are eagles that flying swim? But you just can't say it that way. That thought can't be expressed in that form. Well, if you think about it, it was taken for granted for forever that was just sort of intuitively obvious. But if you think about it, it's not at all obvious. Aristotle defined language as a sound with meaning. Well, what the pursuit of this inquiry tends to show is that that's not correct, that actually language is meaning with sound. And it need not be sound. It can be sign or some other mode of externalization. That's a big difference. It means that the core character of language is the set of principles that yield structured expressions and assign them a meaning. And that part of language is probably, we can't show it yet, but it looks like it's uniform among humans. It doesn't seem to vary much, and if we knew enough, maybe at all. It's just a core property of humans that we have this set of principles that yields an unbounded array of structural expressions that have a semantic interpretation that means something. And when you look into it, it's pretty strange what it means. And that just seems to be shared among humans altogether. There's no known difference among remote tribes in Papua who haven't had other human contact for tens of thousands of years, and children who grow up here. And if you interchange them at infancy, they'll grow into their own society without any problem. So that seems to be a core property of human nature. The externalization, what we call the sound part, is marginal. And it also follows from that that communication is marginal. I mean, it's kind of like a dogma among even scientists who write about these topics, that language is basically a means of communication and evolved as a means of communication. You look at current publications on evolution of language, that's just taken for granted. It apparently is all false. It turns out that from the closer analysis of language, that it's actually a tool for thought. It's a means of expressing thought. And on the side, you can use it for communication, as you can use anything else for communication. Now that gives, actually, if you just introspect for a minute, that shouldn't be surprising. Just ask yourself, what is most of your own use of language? Well, if you introspect, it turns out that probably 99% of it is talking to yourself. Talking to yourself is not communicating. You can't. It takes a tremendous act of will not to talk to yourself. Try it. It's very hard. You're walking down the street. You're talking to yourself in fragments of sentences. It goes on all night, unfortunately. But and sometimes it's used for communication, but even the external part is not much. Well, that's a radically different conception of fundamental human nature. And it does lead to, in other directions, like at least exploring these thoughts about creative work, about moral judgment, and so on. And I think, I don't want to exaggerate. This is by no means universally accepted, even among scientists, but I think that's the direction in which work has been moving. And I think it is a way of finding out basic things about what kind of creatures we are.